Welcome to Fins, Fur, and Feathers, the Fish and Wildlife Management podcast at K-State Research and Extension. I'm Dr. Drew Ricketts.
And I'm Dr. Joe Gergen. We're both lifelong hunters and anglers, K-State Research and Extension specialists who help citizens with their fish, wildlife, and pond management needs. If you've ever had a wildlife or pond management challenge, then this is the podcast for you.
We address common fish and wildlife management problems using a scientific approach to provide proven and practical solutions to the issues that you may be facing.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers. And Drew, you're going to lead us today. We're going to be talking about forest or woodlands. Apparently, there's a difference between those two, I guess, but you're going to jump in and tell us what that difference is.
Yeah, there is for sure. I just got back from Tennessee. We had the National Wildlife Habitat Education Program contest down there last week, and one of the things that I really enjoy about my job is all the traveling around the country that I get to do and learning from other wildlife specialists in different areas. And one of the things that trip really drove home to me was that a lot of the ideas that we have about habitat management can be applied really broadly, but they can also be more applicable in certain places and that sort of thing. And we saw a kind of a neat ecosystem where I was at, where in this Cumberland Plateau area, historically there was a lot of tallgrass prairie out there, a lot of openings with native warm season grasses and forbs and those things like we might see in the Flint Hills here in Kansas. But there's also a lot of mixed hardwood forest, and through time it's transitioned more to an area dominated by that mixed hardwood forest. And seeing some of the areas that they were managing and how some of the different management practices shifted more towards what's natural, that got me really thinking about some of the things that we do in the Great Plains and some of the things that I talk to people about, but that we don't always necessarily have good examples of, where we can take people and show these things. And so I just kind of wanted to talk through some of that stuff today.
Yeah, well, let's jump in and talk about a woodland and a forest. Are there different species there, different amounts? What makes a woodland or a forest, I guess? Talk about that. Maybe there are other descriptions we can use too.
Yeah. So those terms refer basically to how much tree cover is there, and specifically how much sunlight is being intercepted by the canopies of those trees before it gets to the ground. And I think one of the things when we think about habitat management, we're thinking about the critters. If we're thinking more deeply, maybe we're thinking about the plants, the trees, the forbs, the grasses, the different plants that we're trying to promote to support the wildlife. But there's a few things that are really driving that, right? And one of the really, really important things is sunlight. Another really important one's rainfall. But, whether you're in a hardwood system, whether you're in a softwood system, whether you're in a prairie or a desert, what is one of the deciding factors on what you're actually looking at is how dense the canopy is of woody vegetation. And so if we look at a prairie, that's going to be an area that's dominated by less than 10% tree cover. A savanna, which is a term that a lot of people have probably heard, is between 10% and 30% tree cover. And it tends to have a really well-developed herbaceous layer, meaning the non-woody plants that are down on the ground. So lots of grasses, lots of forbs down below. A good example of that might be the cross timbers area down around Fall River between maybe Yates Center in Kansas, kind of on the eastern edge of the southern Flint Hills or the Chautauqua Hills. We have those oak savannas down there. And it's relatively open, and it supports a lot of prescribed fire for cattle production. The next classification is one that you mentioned already. That's a woodland. And so a woodland would have somewhere between 30 and 80% canopy cover of woody plants. And then a forest is above 80%. So that's that really deep, dark area that not very much sunlight is getting through at all.
Yeah. Does the type of trees matter in those classifications, or just the amount?
It's just the amount in those classifications, but along with those, we might say that we had mixed hardwood woodlands. And that would mean that it was dominated by hardwoods, but it's got some non-deciduous tree species out there. Or we may just have hardwood systems, which are wooded areas in Kansas are supposed to be mostly hardwoods, right? We don't have a lot of non-hardwood woodlands in Kansas. Now, historically, one of the interesting things when you read some of the old writings and things like that of people who explored the West, there were some canyons that were dominated by eastern red cedar cover out in north central Kansas, and like in 1869. But those are very limited areas that would have been in sort of a fire shadow. So maybe a north-facing slope that didn't heat up very good, and the fire sort of petered out before it got into them, and those eastern red cedars were allowed to flourish in those areas by escaping those natural fires. But that's not a common type of cover in Kansas. That would have been very, very limited historically. Currently, we've seen a big expansion of that, right, with changes in fire regimes, differences in how much we graze, and lots of those different things.
Yeah, I want to get into that in a little bit, but let's kind of stick with those percentages you talked about. And to me, I know Kansas has a lot of tall grass prairie, right? But I'm imagining some forested or woodland areas, and to me, a perfect forest, what I think of is you walk in and like you mentioned, it's kind of dark. There's not much openings, not much sunlight, but you mentioned briefly that sunlight's important. So maybe chat a little bit about, why is it important, or what does a forest look like? Do we want it to be dark? Do we want it to be light? Somewhere in between.
Yeah. So when we think about that really deep, dark forest, when we walk into a space like that where at high noon you look at the ground and it's almost entirely shaded. It's nice and cool in there probably, or it may be really hot because there's no air moving at all. You got enough trees that they're blocking all the wind, but extremely shaded. And what happens when we end up with that is we lose almost all the grasses that would grow down below the trees. We lose most of the broadleaf herbaceous plants, or the forbs, that would be growing down in there. And we also lose most of the semi-woody species like the vines, or even the low shrubs that would grow. And so from thinking about as time moves along, what that selects for is a whole bunch of species that are adapted to grow in the shade. And when we think about tree species that are adapted to grow in the shade, in Kansas we would, and in a lot of the Great Plains, we would have green ash, hackberry, lots of the elm species, and they're really good at growing below that canopy. And because they can grow in the shade, they get taller and taller and taller, and then they end up intercepting the little bit of sunlight that might be getting through the canopy, and so we get zero down there now. But then, as the maybe species that we might like to have in there, as they start to die, like oaks and hickories, or even cottonwoods if we're further west, as those start to die, then who's waiting there to take their place? It's the ashes and hackberries and elms and honey locust maybe, and some of these other species. And those species are native throughout much of the Great Plains, but they would have been much more limited at one time than they are now. One of the interesting things that we see with those shade-tolerant species too is they tend to be fire intolerant, and that's before they get established. So if we're burning on a fairly regular basis, you wouldn't see many elms or green ashes or hackberries out in the prairie growing. And that tends to be the same in a woodland that's burned on a fairly regular basis. But as you get more and more of those species in there, one of their other adaptations, or I don't know if it's an adaptation, maybe it's a characteristic, is that their leaves are not good fuel for fire. If you think about an oak leaf, it's thick, it's almost like cardboard, and it takes quite a long time for them to degrade. and especially our white oak species, but really all of our oaks in Kansas and the Great Plains are at least somewhat adapted to tolerate fire. And they create the fuel for that next fire by having leaves that are flammable and having leaves that stay flammable for an extended period of time. But those elms and hackberries, as they drop their leaves, they quickly degrade, and they're not good fuel for carrying a fire. And so they tend to promote conditions that select for more and more of those species. I probably went way into the weeds on that further than what you were thinking about, and I might not have answered your question.
I think that's great. Thinking about fire, I know I talk to a lot of people about the benefits of fire, and we tend to think in the Kansas and Great Plains area at least that fire is beneficial for prairies. When you talk about it with forest, I think that's really, it's almost a novel idea. People know about it, and we're not actively thinking about it a lot of times. And I think there's also a fear factor, that might not be the right word, but people are a little bit concerned about the leaf and the leaf litter, and is that going to, is it going to get into the canopy and the whole forest burn down? So, I think there's benefit there, but what should a fire regime look like in these areas?
Yeah, thinking about historical conditions, our woodlands in Kansas would have probably burned every 2 to 3 years historically. They would have had a little bit shorter fire return interval than tallgrass prairie, and probably a longer fire return interval than a lot of the mixed grass and short grass stuff as you move further and further west. The interesting thing about fire and sunlight and rainfall and how all that stuff plays together in these woodland systems is that a fire alone with a relatively closed canopy where we don't have a lot of sunlight getting to the forest floor.
And that's over 80%, or what would you consider a closed canopy?
Well, yeah, over 80% would be closed canopy, but even if we've got, let's say, 60% or more of a canopy cover in our woodlands, if we're running a fire through there, we might be able to get it to burn, but it doesn't you won't see nearly the same response as if we opened it up even more and had a whole bunch of sunlight coming through. And this, if there's foresters listening, they might slap me through their speaker in their car or wherever they're listening from. But, when we're thinking about managing woody areas for wildlife, we tend to want to thin down to more of a savanna type cover. So if we're thinking about white-tailed deer, if we're thinking about wild turkeys, of course, we're going to make sure that we don't remove roost trees, trees that might be providing important food like white oaks and red oaks and some of the hickories and pecans and those mast-producing trees or trees that produce a nut or a soft fruit. We're going to preserve those. We're not going to kill all of those, but we might go in and let's say we've got 70% cover, a 70% canopy cover. You walk into the woods, and at high noon, only 30% of the forest floor has sunlight on it. If I was looking at that, I would probably recommend that we take that down to about 20% canopy cover. And what that's going to do is allow, 50% more sunlight to hit the ground. And so now, instead of being able to get down on a knee, let's say we're at fawn height or turkey hen height when she's sitting on a nest, instead of being able to see 50 yards or 100 yards or 300 yards because there's no sunlight to allow stuff to grow on the forest floor, now all of a sudden it becomes hard to walk through because we're growing grass. We're growing forbs, or those broadleaf non-woody plants that provide so much food and cover for all these different species. We're also growing, in a lot of the Great Plains, we'd be growing blackberries, black raspberries, probably lots of grapevine, probably lots of greenbrier. All those plants are really going to provide a lot of food and cover at the same time for a species like a deer. Also for turkeys, they're also going to be, when we talk about quail and pheasants and those upland birds, we talk about how important soft-bodied insects and other arthropods are for the chicks. Well, it's just as important for a turkey poult. And so, we've got that herbaceous layer that was absent before. And a way to kind of see that, what that might look like a lot of times, when we've got an area of woods, when you get to the edge of it and you're standing right at the edge, it might look like it's got a good understory. There might be all kinds of shrubs and herbaceous plants right there on the edge. Walk in 10 feet and then walk in another 50 feet and 100 feet. And what you'll see is, as you get away from that edge, we had some horizontal sunlight that was coming through, right? But once we get into where that horizontal sunlight's no longer getting to, then we're blocking all that sun, and so there's nothing growing. So that can kind of show you the power of thinning things down. And then once we've thinned it down to where we have all those other plants growing, now when we send a prescribed fire through there, we've got fuel, and we see a lot of the same benefits that we would see of a prescribed fire out in a grassland system. You're removing that standing vegetation. You're regenerating a whole bunch of new vegetation that's more palatable, more nutritious than the old stuff that was standing there, easier to digest for the critters that are going to eat it. And we're also setting back, top killing at least, those woody plants that are shade tolerant and fire intolerant that we don't want to be growing and replacing the other species. And one of the cool things about fire and woody plants, when we're thinking about a species like white-tailed deer, they want to eat new growth on woody vegetation, especially during the fall, winter, and spring. When forbs are available, that's what they're going to select because it's got the most nutrition, it's easiest to digest, and all those sorts of things. But they're browsers. And when we send a fire across a young oak tree or a hackberry tree or an elm tree or a honey locust tree, most of the time we're not killing the root system. We're just killing what's above ground. And then as soon as it can after the fire, that may be the next growing season. If the fire is in the spring, then it's going to be in a month, but it's going to start sending up new shoots, right? And one of the cool things that Marcus Lashley did when he was in Mississippi State, he's the extension wildlife specialist at Florida that talks so much about fire and managing for turkeys and deer and all these sorts of things. He did this thing that he calls mineral stumps. It's just cutting a tree off and letting it sprout back. And if you've ever done that, if you've ever been pasture clearing or cut some trees in the woods and you would normally treat the stumps, but you forget to treat a stump, most of the time when we come back next year, it looks like a little bonsai tree because it's sprouted and those deer have been hammering all that new growth, right? Well, what's happened there is you've taken that large root system and now that tree is putting the same amount of nutrients into those little bitty twigs and leaves that it used to put into a tree. And so we'll start seeing deer use plants that they normally wouldn't eat because we've crammed all those nutrients into such a small amount of vegetation, and so we've made them more nutritious. Well, fire does that too, and that's one of the really cool things about opening things up, running a fire through there. We just create so much food and cover in a space that before was a canopy for birds to be in, and it was a little bit of cover for those critters to be in, but now we've transformed it into an incredibly amount of more cover, but also an incredible amount of food that's available to them as well.
So there's obviously a lot of benefits to wildlife to doing all this. You've mentioned thinning out the forest quite a few times. Is that as simple as going in and just taking a chainsaw and cutting out trees? I mean, is it literally what it sounds like?
Yeah.
Chop them all down?
It is that simple, and there's different ways to do it. So what tends to be the most beneficial in a lot of situations, if you've got an area that most of the trees that we're wanting to kill are 6 inches at breast height or larger, so like 5 or 5.5 feet off the ground, the diameter of the trees are 6 inches, then actually killing that tree and leaving it standing is most of the time the best thing to do.
How would you do that?
So there's two ways. One of them, the old tried and true method, is girdling. And so you could take a chainsaw and make a ring in the bark with that chainsaw, and we're just getting through the bark just barely, because that vascular tissue, the veins in the tree that's sending water up and bringing nutrients back down to the roots from the leaves, they're right underneath the bark. So we just need to cut through the bark and where you can barely see that softwood that's underneath of the bark. If you make a couple of those that are, let's say, 2 inches apart, then a lot of the trees that we do that to will slowly die over time. Some trees that are very vigorous might actually grow new bark over those cuts and heal up. And so we might not actually do much damage to those trees. But if you want to make sure that you get them killed, then we can make that ring, and then we can put some herbicide in that cut that is labeled for cut surface treatment. Some examples of that might be Tordon RTU. There's different concoctions that you can make with Remedy or Garlon or some of these different herbicides. And of course, anytime you're doing this, follow the label instructions and make sure that you're using pesticides appropriately. But that's one way. And if you've got bigger and bigger trees, then oftentimes girdling is the quicker way. If most of the trees that we're killing, let's say, are 10 inches or less at breast height, then it might be quicker to do what they call hack and squirt. And that would be where you go in with a hatchet, make half a dozen cuts around that tree at breast height with your hatchet all the way around the circumference of the tree, and then we squirt some of that cut surface herbicide into those cuts that we made with our hatchet. And then what we're doing there, it may not seem like it's going to do all that much because you still have all that standing dead wood. But the main part of that tree that's intercepting the sunlight's the leaves, right? It's not just that standing dead wood. The other cool thing about that I hadn't thought about all that much until I heard the wildlife specialist from Tennessee say, because I haven't seen these studies that he was talking about, but the variable that they found that was most strongly associated with, I think he said, wildlife diversity in forests in the areas that he has worked in, is how much dead wood there is in that forest. And it's both standing dead wood and also dead wood on the forest floor. And when you think about that, most of the time we think about a dead tree and it's like, well, yeah, woodpeckers are going to eat on that dead tree, and they're going to open up cavities and they're going to nest in them. Eventually, maybe a wood duck can get those woodpecker cavities opened up large enough that they can be in there. We're going to have owls that are going to nest in those cavities too as they get bigger and bigger. Raccoons, possums, those kind of critters are going to use those for dens. But the other thing that dead wood is good for is the reason that the woodpeckers are pecking on it in the first place, right? They're pecking on it because there's insect larvae underneath of them. And all those insects that are in there are food for turkeys, they're food for quail, they're food for all these different critters that might be in the woods that are going to feed on those soft-bodied arthropods. And so there's all kinds of benefits to having those standing dead trees beyond the fact that they're just letting the sunlight through. And here's the other thing that we talked about down there that kind of really threw me for a loop. When we think about a patch of woods here in the Great Plains, and let's say we're managing for a critter like northern bobwhite, and there's some oak trees in there, and it's a nice patch of woods. Well, they might take that down to 5% canopy cover or less.
Wow.
If they're trying to manage for northern bobwhite out there, because they have so much forested cover around them that small-scale management like we think about in the Great Plains isn't on a large enough scale that quail are going to find it and come in from wherever they're coming from. That really low density woody cover, taking it down to that level and starting to manage it with prescribed fire can create some really cool conditions, especially if you don't treat every tree that you kill. If we're cutting trees down rather than girdling all of them, if you've got some of those white oaks and red oaks that are going to resprout time after time after time when we send that fire through there, I don't know that you could create, even with a food plot, the same pounds per acre of food for white-tailed deer that we were seeing in some of those places. It's pretty incredible.
They're going to be pretty happy in there having their little buffet.
Yeah, well, yeah, and you think about a doe wanting to hide a fawn.
Yeah.
She's not going to go find a spot where the only thing on the ground's leaf litter.
Sure.
From trees, and you can see 300 yards. She'd rather go hide her fawn in a ragweed patch or a patch of warm season grass species and that's got some pokeweed next to it and different plants that a farmer might want to spray in their field, but that are protein packed, full of nutrition, good food plants for deer.
I think we've talked quite a bit about, sometimes habitat management can be a lot more beneficial for wildlife and even species that we want to, hunt or chase after, right? And so I think just emphasizing that spending some time out there working on the habitat can provide a lot of the benefits that we're trying to fix with, a feeder or a quick fix, throwing something out like that. So just fun to have those conversations where, one thing kind of leads into the next. But, we've talked about the species you mentioned, a lot of these mast-producing hardwoods. Earlier we talked about the eastern red cedars. So if we were to have, a woodland or a forest, I guess it'd be called that if it's just a bunch of eastern red cedar, would it be similar techniques? Would we be going in and girdling those trees? Would we cut them down and spray them? What do we want to do with those types of trees?
So one of the challenges that you get with eastern red cedar is it can grow so densely that even when it's dead, you may not have the conditions in terms of openness that you might want. But I will say that, we had a pretty catastrophic, very small scale wildfire in the Southern Flint Hills here in Kansas this year that ended up burning down a nursing home. Unfortunately, nobody was hurt, but it resulted in total loss of that nursing home. And we drove by there, Danny and I did yesterday, and it's incredible what's growing underneath what 6 months ago was a closed canopy cedar forest. There would have been no sunlight getting through there. If you could have gotten down low enough and looked that you were below those cedar branches, there wouldn't have been any herbaceous plants growing because there was no sunlight getting through. And it looks like a new little prairie out there. I mean, just driving along on the highway looking in. Of course, there were all kinds of pioneer species like pokeweed and ragweeds and that kind of stuff growing. But it was incredible to me how quickly, without removing any of those trees, just with killing them with fire, there's already blue stem and Indian grass and those native warm season grasses that are so important growing in there. The challenge with that sort of management with eastern red cedars is a couple of different things. It's absolutely possible to create canopy fire in that eastern red cedar closed canopy forest that will kill those trees a couple of different ways. One of them would be to do what a lot of people call cut and stuff. And that's a practice where, we cut a few eastern red cedar that are either along the boundary of that closed canopy forest or let's say that are outgrowing in a rangeland next to it or something. And then we use our skid steer, whatever equipment we've got, and we take those cut trees and we stuff them up into the edge. And then that becomes what a prescribed fire specialist would call ladder fuel. And so when our fire from the rangeland area next to it or wherever we're setting the fire gets to those stuffed trees, we've given them enough time to dry out so that those cedar leaves are highly flammable, that catches, and then it carries fire up the trees on the edge and into the canopy. And if you've got enough breeze and low enough humidity, it'll carry that fire on through the canopy until it runs out of trees to go through. Now, that is the kind of fire conditions that are very, very challenging to manage, and that can also lead to spot fires many miles away because of the fallout of the embers from that fire. And then, of course, the other kind of situation that we get into is when we've got high winds, very low humidity, and we get a wildfire that gets up into the canopy on those trees. And so that's a kind of situation that most people aren't necessarily prepared to do themselves, probably. It would take somebody with a whole lot of experience with prescribed fire or a control over a whole lot of acres around it, so that if that fire did get out, it's okay. So we tend to not think about managing eastern red cedar that way. Most of the time, if we've got a closed canopy eastern red cedar forest, we're going to cut those trees down, move them somewhere, maybe just in that same area, but get them stacked up and get them burned. The other challenge associated with leaving cedar skeletons or cedar carcasses, I've heard both terms, just the dead wood without the leaves on it of those cedar trees, is that birds like to perch on those. And many of our songbirds that eat cedar berries and sumac berries and mulberries and all these sorts of things, they're going to perch on those cedar skeletons and they're going to poop those seeds out. And so in that area that we've just cleared, now we've got this seed rain from those birds, and that those same things are going to be coming up in there. So it's good to get them piled up and get them burned if you can.
If we just cut them off flat and didn't treat them, would they make mineral stumps like we talked about with those hardwoods?
So that's one of the nice things about cedars, if you're trying to control them, is that as long as you cut below the lowest green branch on an eastern red cedar, they don't sprout back.
You don't have to treat them with herbicide or anything. They just won't come back.
Nope. You just cut them off, and as long as you get below that lowest green branch, you're good. The other thing, along with what you asked, is that if a white-tailed deer is eating eastern red cedar, it's starving, at least where we live. So you've got bigger problems there going on than just your eastern red cedars, or maybe that's why they might be eating eastern red cedar. But that's not a food plant for white-tailed deer. The berries are for some songbirds, like we said, but you're not gonna promote them eating those cedars by making a mineral stump out of it.
So girdling them or, treating them that way, there might be a little bit of benefit, but that's more for those hardwood species. Is that generalization, but is that correct as a generality?
Yeah, that's a good generalization. And the other really cool thing that we see, whether it's more of a savanna type situation where you've got scattered eastern red cedars that might be fairly large, that have been there a while, or a dense cedar woodland or forest where we have very little sunlight coming through, almost as soon as you remove those trees, they're going to have that layer of cedar needles or cedar leaves underneath of them that doesn't have really anything growing through it. As soon as a rain comes through and washes that layer off, you're going to get an explosion of those early successional plants. And almost all of those plants are ice cream plants for white-tailed deer. And it's really cool to see, like, let's say we cut a 50-year-old eastern red cedar out in the middle of a pasture. If you come back the next growing season, you're going to see pokeweed and spiny wild lettuce and a bunch of these different plants that are sprouting. And if there are any white-tailed deer around, they will find them and they will have them browsed off. So you can actually make little micro food plots just by cutting cedars down.
Little ice cream plants. I think we need to have whole episode about ice cream plants. I like that.
Yeah, I
like that term for sure.
Range management term.
I think that when we think about habitat management, at least my mind, I tend to think that trees are good, and I tend to think all trees are good. And so it's a good conversation to have, thinking about how we might manage those woody habitats or woodland habitats in addition to just the open spaces as well.
Yeah.
So I think that just having all of that information about what to manage, how to manage it, it's just kind of fun to think about how we raise up our habitat management, that next level, how we start to think about managing the woodland habitat and all the benefits that might come for the wildlife species based on those management actions.
Yeah.
Thanks to all of our listeners for following along and joining us for another episode, and we'll be back in a couple weeks with another aquatic episode.
Fins, Fur, and Feathers is hosted by K-State Research and Extension and is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
The network and this podcast are supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act.